Welcome back to Fast Market. I'm Alex Coffey alongside Kevin Hinks. Kevin, we got to continue to talk the macro markets on a day like today. So quickly, S&P's up 5. They're in green territory. NASDAQ running away with it is up 116. Russell and the Dow both in red territory still. I think the Russell is on the lows of the session essentially here. So Kev, as we assess the morning, we start considering where things stand. Well, for one, it almost seems like a foregone conclusion now that the NASDAQ's going to hit this 15,000 mark. But Kev, is it worrisome that as I tweeted earlier, the modern day flight to quality trade seems to be the 4 mega caps in Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and Alphabet? We are starting to see less and less names trading higher as the market continues to cruise to new heights.
Yeah, really interesting makeup of what this market is doing today. And think about this, Alex. When you look at Microsoft having a strong day, that's in 3 of the 4 major indices. Apple having a strong day, that's in 3 of the 4 major indices as well. So it's hard to sell this market off when Microsoft and Apple are having good days. That being said, some interesting looks, the payment space. Even though financials are soft based on earnings, Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, Square, they're all strong today. Pretty interesting makeup. So you're right, Alex. They're leaning on the FANG stocks, which highlights the NASDAQ, but also affects the S&P 500 as well. So really interesting day, evolving here right in front of us.
I love the point about the payment space, Kev, because I think that complicates the story a little bit. If we're worried about economic recovery, how are the names that are the most tied to consumer activity doing all right? But that might be a story for another day. Let's go to cash tags. I'd like to welcome in TD Ameritrade Network contributor Jenny Horn joining us here in studio. We've got the co-founder of LikeFolio.com, Landon Swan, on the line as well. Jenny, we're going to shift gears. We're going to talk some reopening. We're going to talk some Delta Airlines ahead of earnings here. A lot to consider here. We got energy costs. We got inflation. This is a huge part of it. And then we got earnings, of course.
Yes, and I would say that the price right now sort of reflects that. It's shed about 11% in the last 3 months. And this is one of these names that, on a yearly chart, it actually looks pretty healthy. It's been in a pretty solid run up since about November when we, of course, got this positive vaccine news. But now, if you look at a 3-year chart, you can sort of see that it's about 20% below its pre-pandemic levels still. So the airlines have really yet to see this strong recovery. Now, they will kick off their sort of airline earnings season tomorrow with their second quarter earnings. And like you just mentioned, Alex, there is a good degree of risk in this industry as a whole, with 2 major headwinds I really see, one being the spread of this Delta variant of COVID-19 and the other being the rising jet fuel prices that could potentially damper some of their operating costs. So jet fuel prices are up about 4% in the last month and 70% in the last year. So this is obviously going to weigh on the airline sector as a whole. Now, one challenge for Delta specifically that sort of sets it apart from some of the other airlines is one of its most profitable segments is actually from international high-end travel, which we know, of course, is taking longer than expected to recover given some of these global headwinds we're seeing with the pandemic. Now, the Delta variant is also weighing on summer leisure travel, but some analysts are saying it may not impact the U.S. as much as international, of course, but it is something to still consider even as we head into these fall slower months, which I think guidance for so many of these names is going to be so critical, because if they're not able to recover even to a degree, I think the stocks could potentially just get killed. But one upside for the quarter is that we're seeing about a 50% improvement for TSA checkpoint data in the second quarter, which could potentially sort of damper or help some of Delta's losses per share. And so I think that's important to keep in mind, that a lot of this headline risk we've seen has been as of late. It may not impact this current quarter that we're seeing tomorrow. So I think that's important to keep in mind. But that brings me to our first tweet of the day, which sort of talks about the mixed bag that is Delta ahead of this report, which says Delta might get bumpy this week. There are earnings on the 14th, so some of the strength could be the expectation it will be better than expected. I also wonder if COVID concerns will do some damage here at some point, and it would be closer to Carnival without earnings. So I thought that was interesting, because I do understand that the Carnival and Delta are both in the travel sector, but I have to say, from a at least a price basis and looking at these two on a chart, Delta and the airlines as a whole have fared a little bit better than the cruise lines and Carnival. But our next tweet sort of talks about, a happy customer with Delta, because I couldn't, make it all negative today. I had this report which says, I love Delta. I missed a flight with another airline, booked with them last minute. They overbooked the flight. They offered money to stay back, and I actually made money on that flight. So, Landon, when we're looking, I've actually had this experience, which we were joking, is this actually even that positive? But I've had this experience. I don't mind it. But I do know one thing, true and true, when we talk Delta, this is one of the happiest stocks for LikeFolio in terms of airlines, of course. We talked, I believe, not too long ago about Southwest versus Delta. So I'm curious if Delta has pulled ahead as of recently.
Yeah, actually, they have by 1 point. So Delta is at 46, Southwest is 45. All airlines have actually dropped quite a bit lately. There's a lot of cancellations that have happened across the board. I think United has actually fared fairly well. They've actually moved somehow into first place, so at 50%. But then you've got American at like 34, under Allegiant and over by Spirit. So American's sort of separating itself at the bottom end. But when you look at just total purchase intent change, you can see here that, Delta is doing very well. It's actually leading the board on the big airlines as far as change year over year on people talking about taking flights. And I think a lot of that has to do with the return of traveling to work. It's not all the way back by any means, but it is starting to come back. And we know that, Southwest is more of the leisure airline, whereas Delta does a lot more on the business side. But of course, business travelers are only maybe 10 or 15% of total travelers, but they make up a very large percentage of the revenue, an outsized portion of that revenue, because they're taking the first class, they're taking the upgraded seats, things like that. So you can see traveling for work, it's not back yet, but it is starting to recover. We've also got other data on things like virtual conferences. While still up versus 2019, it's down 58% year over year, 30% quarter over quarter. So virtual conferences are going away. People figured out that they don't really work that well. So for the larger meetings, I think you're going to see business travel coming back. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. Traveling for work up around 40%. Huge change. Leisure is already there. And of course, we mentioned last time, I think maybe 6 months ago, we talked about airlines and we said road trips are coming back. They're huge. They were booming. Everyone's not flying, but they want to take trips. And now that's going away because leisure's up and airlines are back. So all those people that bought RVs are kind of out of luck, I guess. But Delta's doing very well. Purchase intent's roaring back. Traveling for work is leading the way. Still not there yet, but there are signs that this is coming back. I mentioned virtual conferences down significantly. In-person conference mentions are actually up about 16% quarter over quarter. So everything's pointing very strong towards Delta. We're not there yet, but I think that investors are going to, have a sigh of relief when they see these kind of numbers coming out.
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would do if I'm the CEO of Delta Airlines is that I tell my PR department to call the CDC and please name this variant something other than Delta variant, because it sounds like we invented it, right? Can you please help us out there? Call it the Southwest variant there and help us out. But I think Delta, Landon, I remember your data in the past as being extremely positive for Delta, and Delta residing at the top of the happiness scale. Now it looks like they're starting to return to that top of the happiness scale, but they need those other parts, right? Leisure travel, which helps Southwest, they need more than that for Delta to do well. But my question to you is, what is holding up these airlines? Is it just the overall debt that they've taken on? Is it the higher gas prices? Is it the Delta variant? What does your data say is starting to trail off as the rest of, the TSA numbers are doing well? It's weekend TSA numbers, which tells me that it's more leisure, less business, but they're starting to tick up across the board. Landon, what are you guys seeing in terms of what took this stock from the mid-50s back to the low 40s here, in your opinion?
Sure. Well, first of all, a couple of things that you mentioned. Jenny talked about the TSA numbers. The July 4th weekend was actually, this last one was higher than the 2019 July 4th weekend. So a lot of people are returning back to travel. Obviously, that's not business travel, which Delta needs. Also, little side note, I'm pretty sure that Corona beer actually increased their sales after the whole coronavirus thing came out. So maybe this isn't bad for Delta. Who knows? It gets the name out there. Bad. Any PR is good PR, right? No, but so what we're seeing is the airlines, they're coming back. People are flying. They're becoming more comfortable. You don't see the nightmare story of a whole plane is infected with COVID, right? That's what everyone was fearing. And I think people are getting a lot more comfortable flying. But for a company like Delta that relies so heavily on business travel, you've got to get the companies more comfortable. It's easy for an individual to say, all right, I'm going to travel, my family's going to travel. But for a company, they're more risk adverse. They've got to make that, get that past the risk department and say, okay, can we actually host an event? What if something happens? There's so many what ifs with companies that right now they're saying, maybe some of the more aggressive ones are going after it, but a lot of them are saying, you know what, let's stick with Zoom for now. So I think that's really key. And then, of course, you've got all the things that, I have no insight into, but Jenny mentioned a few of them, like the Delta variant, jet fuel prices. You've also got the potential for labor shortages. So there's a lot of reasons why this stock is off 20% from its highs. But just looking forward, I do think that it's starting to turn the corner, and investors should see this as a positive sign. Incidentally, you know how we put that earnings score out for every company? Delta's a plus 13 right now, which really is in a neutral range. So we're not taking an aggressive position into this earnings report, but we do see signs of life. We see positive signs for this company in the future.
Okay, Landon, you basically just took my question because I was going to say, I know you all don't track or non-English speaking tweets, but I am curious about Delta's exposure to international travel, because now I think there's even more fear that that will come back even slower than we initially anticipated, which will impact them, of course. So is there any concern for that there? Because while business travel may be coming back, like you said, more than we expect, international is still there.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that, like you said, LikeFolio mentions are only English speaking, but still there's a lot of people that travel over to Europe. Not right now. There's very little travel between Europe and the United States, and I think that is a big problem for Delta. That has to be opened up. I think that it's all going to come down to government restrictions and things like the CDC. So obviously, we have no data or insight into that. We'll see how it plays out, but I like the trend just in general is that things are starting to open up and continue, and there hasn't been any major scares really when it comes to outbreaks and things like that, especially when it comes to on planes.
Landon, as we kind of go through these one by one, I know Delta's in focus here on the eve of its earnings release, but you mentioned United Airlines kind of taking the lead on happiness, which is unique for what we've watched over the years here with these names. So to me, that says this is much more about Delta and Southwest, as you said, maybe lacking on an execution somewhere. So maybe, as you mentioned, cancellations, those who fly United may be used to that. So talk to me what's going on here. I had to take the shot here a little bit, but with American Airlines, you talked about them struggling. So what's going on with American? What's the theme as to why they're struggling? What is the reason for this shuffling that we're seeing?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it, like you said, has to do with cancellations, and maybe there is some built-in lower expectations with United. I mean, that's a good shot, but I think it's valid. I think that over time, Delta and Southwest will rise back to the top and surpass everyone on happiness. They're right there with United. They took a dip due to cancellations, whereas United dips was smaller. American, though, they have had a lot of bad press. There's the way that they handle, I think, the masks, they've kicked off, like, I think a 2-year-old, they kicked off a special needs person because of masks. Like, I think that they're getting a lot of negative press, and just in general, they're a little bit more strict, whereas United or Delta, especially Delta and Southwest, are just more friendly and say, hey, these are the rules, you got to follow them, but we'll be friendly about it, whereas Americans just, not so nice. And then, of course, Spirit and Allegiant have always been really low on happiness, and they continue to be so. But I am concerned with American's happiness dropping that low, actually lower than Allegiant. I have no doubts that Delta and Southwest will rise back to the top once all the cancellations sort of shake out. I think that it's tough. It's very difficult for planning because you don't know how many people are returning to travel, returning to work, all that. So over time, I think they'll do better with that, but not yet.
Landon, as we wrap things here, you mentioned the 13, I believe it was, positive earnings score for Delta. So, as you said, kind of neutral to bullish, but really more of a neutral call here, which feels right given everything we've talked about. But as we go in the long term, you're watching these trends of traveling for work start to perk up a bit as travel for leisure has already been there, particularly on the flying front, and you're seeing the road trip volume come down. As you look at kind of the two names that you mentioned, which are Southwest and Delta, which have consistently been the names that you guys like the best in this group, does this environment favor Delta over Southwest, which has been the leader throughout the recovery?
Well, so I think that Southwest has already got its travelers back. You know, I talked about July 4th weekend being higher than 2019. I think, generally speaking, Southwest has its travelers back. So I think maybe it's all priced in there, whereas Delta hasn't got them back, but it is starting to return. So if I had to pick between the two as far as upside from here, I'd go Delta.
Good stuff. The co-founder of LikeFolio.com, Landon Swan, thanks as always. Really an interesting conversation. Crazy to see just how much traveling for work is already coming back because, guys, as I look at this, it doesn't feel like it's come back at all. So for it only to be down 22% based off the mentions count from 2019 is just absolutely incredible, Jenny, because, I mean, the sky's the limit, I feel like, on where travel was for work and where it feels like it actually is.
I know, and it almost feels assuring, though, when you go to an airport and you see all of these different business travelers. I mean, I would guess they're on business, obviously, I'm assuming, but you see all these different types of travelers, and I think that almost, rest assures sort of Landon's case. But I have to say, though, that what matters with these airlines is they're so risky. I mean, they just move, like you saw today, they're all down today. They move significantly, and they all sort of move in tandem. And so I have to say there's that degree of risk there that concerns me. Less about this Delta variant, less about, its efficacy against some of these vaccines we've already gotten. I think it's less about all of that and the politics behind it. It's more the fact that headline risk really affects Delta. So, Kevin, when you look at this name,